Hey guys, it's Tom. Welcome back to the Pornstar channel. I'm doing a little bit of a refresh on Blue just to get it ready for fall mats, and I figured I'd use the chance to do a really quick and dirty video on how to do the FDF Mantis kit install on a BRZ, FRS 86, whatever. That's probably one of the most prevalent questions that I find in my inbox, is how to install and set up the Mantis kit on this chassis. And because I built this before I started my channel, I don't have any kind of like build logs or anything on this car. So I figured I'll do a really quick and dirty video for you guys just to show you the key areas where the car needs to be cut, what needs to be installed where, just give you a quick rundown. So bear with me. Alright, starting under the hood, you can see that for one, my bay is filthy as heck, but at least there's holographic flake all over the car, so that helps. So this view here is to show you the install of the camber caster plates, aka the top heads of your coilovers. So what you can see here is we're at the passenger side of the car, and you can see the orientation of those pillow ball mounts. And essentially what these do is they correct the caster and the KPI by repositioning your coilover. Now, naturally, when you do this, you'll see that you're right within the bolt circle of where the strut mounts are in the tower. And so there isn't room for your shock because, well, normally it sits here, right? So you can see that there is a little bit of clearance cutting required. I did this by taking the top head assembly and just bolting it to the car from underneath, and then using a Sharpie through the pillow ball bearing that you mount this to show me where the center is of where I needed to create the clearance for the shock rod. And then I just used a step drill bit to drill into the strut tower to generate the required clearance, and then I finished it off by just using an angle grinder to make some cuts. And that's all the clearance that is required to make these top heads work. So really not a big tear up. Alright, car is on the lift. Here we are on the driver's side looking up at the strut. And here you can see how much off the center where it used to be located these top heads relocate your strut. Here's a shot at the knuckle as well as the tie rod and extended arms. You can also see my sway bar. So here, let's focus on a few things that are different than what you're used to with stock components. So as far as the arms themselves are concerned, they should be pretty self-explanatory. This is the orientation you want to have them mounted in the car, with this obviously being the front of the vehicle. And you'll note that there is a tab on the lower control arm for the sway bar. We'll talk about that more, but obviously that part of it goes up. If it doesn't, you have the arm on the wrong side. As far as adjustments go, the primary function of the heim joint in the front is to adjust your caster. So lengthening this arm will move this arm backwards and reduce your caster. Shortening that arm, meaning screwing the heim joint in further, will move this point forward and therefore increase your caster. In order to make adjustments here, these two fasteners will need to be loosened. So leave those just hand tight when you're making adjustments. Okay? The main function of this heim joint, as well as that heim joint, is two things. For one, it'll control the track width of the car, aka the longer this is, the more white body you need. So yes, very much, many white body, all the white, please. And also, of course, the longer this is, the more you're going to increase your KPI and your camber. So that's why it's important to have those top heads up there to account for how much length you're adding here, basically, so that your KPI and your camber don't go completely out of whack. And not that this means much of anything, but laying here under the car, it's pretty funny to see how the wheels are cranked. So yeah, I love FDF kits, no surprise there. And this setup gives you angle out the, well, you know where. More install stuff. If you have the full Mantis kit that utilizes the stock steering rack, you will get these offset rack spacers. I'll try to show this the best I can, but you'll see here that they have anti-rotation features so that they don't spin on your steering rack. So what that means is, in order to install these, you basically have to drop the steering rack out of the car, which really isn't as big a deal as that may sound. It's really straightforward. And you'll have to take an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. You'll want to put the bolt into the spacer to see where this anti-rotation tab lands on your steering rack. Mark that with a Sharpie, and then with a cutoff wheel, notch the steering rack so that these anti-rotation tabs can engage. That's what will keep the offset rack spacers from spinning on you. So you need to do that on both sides. Luckily, pulling the steering racks in these cars is pretty easy. You've got a fastener here, got the same fastener on the other side, and then you'll see up there where that pink mark is, that's where the steering shaft goes to your steering rack. So you open all three of those after your tie rods are removed, and then the whole shebang just comes out of the car. Depending on the sway bar setup that you have, you will probably want to remove the brackets that hold the sway bar on along with the sway bar. But yeah, this comes out nice and easy. And then you can just pull the boots, mark where your offset rack spacers go, do those zip cuts. Before you install the steering rack back into the car, what I would suggest you do is that you go to the ends of your steering rack and you ensure with a tape measure that your steering rack is centered. And then you look inside the car and make sure that the steering wheel is centered. And then you actually bolt it in, put the spline back together and run that bolt through there, just to make sure that the steering rack and the steering wheel are in the correct relationship to each other. Another important thing are the clearance cuts that you need to make to your cross member to allow for these offset rack spacers to work. So if you compare what you see here, the cross member right in front of the steering rack, to your car, you will notice that I have a good portion of material removed here. Specifically, if you look above the steering rack here, there is a horizontal cut and then a vertical cut. The vertical cut is pretty much right where the housing of the steering rack ends, and the horizontal cut is laid out such that you have clearance for the actual offset rack spacer and the fastener of it. So that's what you need to make sure that you create clearance for. Best I can describe this is you're essentially cutting a triangle out of your cross member. It's literally just two straight cuts, one horizontal one and one vertical one. And you just have to take out enough to generate clearance for the offset rack spacer. FDF does include in the kit little sheet metal tabs that you can weld into the cross member to reinforce it. I'll be honest, I was lazy. I never did that because I was in a rush to install it, and it's been 2 years and I forgot to weld them in, and so far I can't see any ill effects. So whether they're required or not, I'll leave that up to you, but to correctly do it, you should weld those in. Another thing to note is the sway bar and the sway bar end links. So I'm sure you'll know that on your factory setup or aftermarket coilovers, the sway bar typically ties to those tabs on the coilover. Now with the extreme steering angles that this kit achieves, that'll give you an incredible amount of binding in your steering. So instead you want to tie the sway bar end links to the control arms, and the control arms have tabs on them to do just that, as you can see. Problem is the stock sway bar end links won't work. So I did not research what kind of aftermarket options there are. I simply went ahead, bought some Moog end links, cut them, welded them, and that's been how I've been running the setup for well, 2 years now, and it's never given me a hiccup. So I think you can get these off of Rock Auto for probably like $9. And if you have a buddy with a welder, it really doesn't take much to shorten them and weld them back together. Like I said, this was just going to be a quick and dirty video. This is really nothing super technical or exciting, but I feel like that it does a better job of answering the questions I typically get in a way that's more visual than me taking a couple of pictures and replying to your guys' messages. So I hope this helps somebody out that is putting their kid on the car. Another thing I always get asked is what kind of settings I run and wheel specs I run. And it's not that I don't want to share those, I absolutely will, but there are so many variables when you're installing a kit like an FDF kit on a car. Just the control arm length that you choose will throw off all the other values, you know? And so it's really hard to compare from one car to the other. And just because I run these settings doesn't by any stretch of the imagination means that those are like the perfect settings. That just gets the car to drive the way I want it to drive. If you want your car to have a tendency to pull on a tighter line, or you want the car to run on a wider line, you want more or less self-steer, there are almost infinite number of options of how you can set a kit like this up. And that's one of the reasons I like FDF so much, because they're so extremely adjustable that you're not really baked into any kind of driving characteristic of the car. You can really adjust it however you like. The flip side of that, of course, is that you can put an FDF kit on a car and it works like absolute crap because you have over-centering, you didn't account for interference of the wheels with the chassis or bumpers or fenders or what have you. So it's a little more involved to install, but the benefit is that you can make it anything you want it to be. So I'm just going to check my notes from the last time I did an alignment on this car, and then I'm just going to rattle those numbers off to you. And if you want to use that as a starting point, be my guest, but I'm not going to say that that's the right way to configure this kit. That's just what I like. Found my notes. Last time this car was aligned, it had 7.5 degrees of negative camber up front. I had 0.5 degree per side of toe in the front. My rear setup is a little bit of a homebrew situation, and bear in mind that I'm running a wide body, so all my, contact point, lever length, all that stuff is a little different than if you're on a stock body car. But what I have found to work well for me is in the rear. I experimented with positive camber before, but it varies so much with the track, and everything changes so much that I'm not sure how to really explain this easily and quickly that makes sense to people. But what I did, instead of messing too much with the camber settings, I dialed my camber to 0, and then I messed with the ride height to change where in the camber curve the car is when it actually squats, when it's driving, until I liked the tire wear. So just because at my ride height with the stance of my car, 0 camber in the back works for me to get absolutely even tire wear. It doesn't mean it will work for you necessarily. There are so many factors. That's what I'm saying. Comparing notes on this, it's almost pointless. But I always get asked, so here you go. And then in the rear, I run 0.5 degree per side of toe in. Basically the same as in the front. We covered camber and toe. Now let's touch real quick on Ackerman. So, lots of things factor into your Ackerman on the way the car is set up. But as far as the plates go, I chose the neutral plates, meaning the plates where the bolt is centered in the Ackerman plate. That's what I'm running. And now the position of your steering rack relative to the pivot points, which of course is also affected by your caster setting, all that stuff will also play into your Ackerman characteristics. So that's what I'm saying. There's just so many variables. But as you can see, of course, I'm using the forward-most position in my offset rack spacer to get the tie rods as close to the pivot point as possible, which, helps with all kinds of things, including over-centering and such. And you'll probably notice that I haven't touched on caster yet. And there's a reason for that, and that is that I do all my own alignments, and I do them in my garage. And measuring caster by the book, by yourself, is a real pain in the rear. So I have some slightly unconventional methods to measure caster that have worked really well for me. And one of the things that I can tell you as far as the settings on my cars go is I have adjusted the lower control arms for the widest possible track width that gives you safe heim joint engagement in the arm. So I made this thing as wide as possible for as much clearance as possible. And then I made sure, as you can see, my rocker boxes are neither bashed in nor cut or nothing. So I made sure that through the whole range of my steering sweep, I do not have any rubbing or interference with these boxes that people commonly cut. Now, I understand that that's not an exact caster number, and there is simply not one that I want to really give out because the methods which I measure here aren't going to correlate to a professional rack that you may use. And so I'm just going to keep those to myself to not confuse people. All that matters for me is that my measurements are repeatable and that I can make changes A to B. But if you are having interference with your side skirts, with your fenders, with your rocker boxes, then either your wheel settings are too aggressive and your scrub radius is way out of whack, or you haven't dialed in enough caster. So I hope those pointers help guide people a little bit. What I have done is I have clearance cut the front bumper completely. You can see that where the side marker used to be, I followed that body line, and I barely, with the car on the ground, it clears that. If I were to move the wheel now, that the car is jacked up, which is hard to do when you're standing there with your phone. If I were to move it, you can see that it interferes with the front bumper. When it's actually on the ground, it doesn't. But just to give you an idea how far forward my wheels are, that's the best I can do for you guys. Sorry. Well, there you have it. I understand that this isn't particularly thrilling content, but if you're working on setting up your car with an FDF kit, I hope that I was able to show you guys what needs to be cut where, the correct orientation the arms go onto the car, and gave you at least a few pointers to get you started on your quest to the perfect alignment that suits your driving style. So yeah, have a good one. I'll see you at the track. Cheers.